He thought she was just a maid, until she exposed the truth that brought him to his knees. Richard Calloway was a billionaire who believed money solved everything. Owner of luxury hotels, tech companies, and private jets, he was known for one thing more than his wealth: his temper. Employees feared him. Executives avoided eye contact. Even board members chose their words carefully around him. One rainy evening, Richard stormed into his penthouse suite after a disastrous business meeting. His tie was loose, his patience gone. He noticed something immediately. A small crystal statue, worth over $200,000, was missing from the glass table. "Who was in here?" he roared. Standing near the window, holding a cleaning cloth, was a quiet woman in a simple uniform. Her name was Elena Brooks. She had worked there for 2 years. She was efficient, invisible, silent, until now. "Did you touch my table?" Richard demanded. Elena stood straight, calm. "Yes, sir, I was dusting. And now my statue is gone," he snapped. "Do you know how much that cost?" She didn't lower her eyes. "I didn't take anything, sir." Richard laughed bitterly. "Of course you didn't, that's what they all say." The room fell silent. Other staff members froze in the hallway. Elena felt the weight of the accusation. She had heard tones like that before, the assumption, the judgment, but instead of crying, instead of arguing, she did something unexpected. She pulled out her phone. Richard blinked, clearly not expecting that reaction. "What are you doing? Calling someone to help you lie?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, but Elena's fingers didn't shake. She calmly unlocked her screen and opened an app. The faint reflection of the office lights shimmered across the glass display. "No, sir," she said evenly. "I'm opening the security feed." A murmur rippled through the hallway. Richard's jaw tightened. "Security feed? Yes, sir. You asked me to install the temporary cameras last month after the break-in next door. You said you didn't trust anyone." Her words were steady, respectful, but they carried weight. Richard's expression shifted just slightly. He had forgotten, or maybe he hadn't expected her to remember. "The cameras record 24/7, Elena continued, "including this office." She turned the screen toward him. The small red icons confirmed active recording. With a few taps, she scrolled back through the footage timeline. The timestamp showed earlier that morning. Richard crossed his arms. "Fine, show me." Staff in the hallway leaned closer, careful not to be obvious. The tension in the air felt electric. Elena pressed play. The video showed her entering the office at 8:42 a.m., carrying a microfiber cloth and cleaning spray. She moved methodically, dusting shelves, wiping the desk, adjusting a stack of papers. The bronze statue sat clearly in the center of the table, glinting under the light. "Pause it," Richard said sharply. She paused. The statue was visible. Untouched, Richard swallowed but quickly recovered. "Skip ahead." She did. The footage showed her finishing the desk, stepping back to admire the shine, and leaving the office at 8:55. The statue remained exactly where it had been. "That proves nothing," Richard muttered, though his voice had lost some of its force. Elena didn't argue. She simply fast-forwarded further. At 9:17 a.m., the office door opened again. A different figure stepped inside. Silence deepened. The camera angle captured only part of the person at first: an expensive watch, the sleeve of a tailored jacket. Then the face became clear. It was Daniel, Richard's nephew, the one who had started helping at the company 2 weeks ago. Daniel looked around cautiously. He walked straight to the table, picked up the bronze statue, examined it. His lips curled into a smirk. He slipped it into his leather bag and walked out. The video ended. Elena lowered the phone slowly. The hallway was so quiet it felt hollow. Richard stared at the frozen image of his nephew on the screen, his face drained of color. For a long moment he didn't speak. That must be a misunderstanding," he said weakly, but the evidence was undeniable. The timestamp, the clear image, the deliberate movement. One of the staff members shifted uncomfortably. Another quietly stepped back, as if witnessing something private. Richard ran a hand through his hair. The anger that had filled the room moments ago now seemed misplaced, heavy, embarrassing. Elena kept her posture straight. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't smile. She simply waited. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Richard asked, though the question sounded more like he was speaking to himself. "You didn't ask for proof, sir," Elena replied gently. "You asked for someone to blame." The words were soft, but they landed hard. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The realization settled over him like dust in sunlight. He had jumped to conclusions, not because of evidence, not because of logic, but because of bias, because it was easy. Elena had worked there for 3 years. She had never been late, never taken a day off without notice. She knew every corner of the building better than most managers, and yet, in a single moment, all of that had been erased by suspicion. Richard began, then stopped. Pride wrestled with guilt in his expression. The staff in the hallway pretended to busy themselves, but everyone was listening. Finally, Richard straightened his jacket. "It appears I made an error." The words sounded formal, distant, but not enough. Elena remained silent. He cleared his throat. "Elena, I owe you an apology." Now the room truly stilled. He wasn't a man known for apologies. "I spoke without thinking. I accused you without evidence. That was wrong." Elena studied him carefully. She wasn't searching for perfection, just sincerity. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "I'll handle Daniel," Richard added, his voice firm again, but this time directed elsewhere. Elena nodded. Once the staff dispersed, whispers trailing behind them, the office felt different, lighter, but also exposed. Richard looked at her once more. "You were very composed." "I've learned that anger doesn't clear your name," she replied. "Truth does." He gave a faint, humbled nod. As she turned to leave, he called after her. "Elena," she paused. "From now on, you won't just be dusting tables. I think it's time we talked about a different role for you, one that reflects your integrity." For the first time, a small smile touched her lips, not because of promotion, not because of victory, but because respect, real respect, had finally entered the room, and sometimes that was worth more than any bronze statue. Richard scoffed. "You think your phone will save you?" The edge in his voice cut through the office like a blade. A few employees lingered near the doorway, pretending to organize files while clearly listening. Elena didn't flinch. She calmly opened an app. "So when I started working here, I noticed things often went missing in this building, so I protect myself." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was steady, thoughtful, prepared. She turned the screen toward him. It was video footage from a small body camera hidden on her uniform, something she wore for her own safety. The tiny lens had been sewn discreetly near the seam of her collar, barely noticeable unless someone knew to look for it. She had started wearing it 6 months ago, after 2 separate incidents where misplaced items somehow turned into whispered suspicions about the cleaning staff. She had learned a long time ago that innocence wasn't always enough. Sometimes you needed proof. The video began playing. The footage showed her entering Richard's office earlier that morning. The angle moved naturally with her body as she walked toward the large oak desk. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting soft reflections on the polished surface. She picked up a cloth, sprayed cleaner, wiped slowly and methodically. The crystal statue stood in the center of the table, tall, transparent, shaped like a soaring eagle. It sparkled under the light. Elena carefully dusted around it, lifting it briefly to clean underneath. The camera captured every detail: her hands, the table, the statue, then showed her placing it back exactly where it had been. She stepped back, inspected her work, then exited the room. The timestamp in the corner was sharp and clear. 9:12 a.m. "Fast forward," Richard muttered. Though his earlier confidence had begun to thin, Elena slid her finger across the screen. The footage jumped ahead to 9:26 a.m. The office door opened again. But this time, Elena was nowhere in sight. The camera angle remained fixed from her uniform, now resting against her cleaning cart just outside the hallway. The lens, though angled slightly sideways, still captured a clear view of Richard's office through the open doorway. A figure walked in, Richard's personal assistant Marcus. He was on the phone, his voice low and hurried. "Yes, I'll handle it," Marcus said, packing toward the desk. "He doesn't need to know the details yet." Richard stiffened. The video showed Marcus glancing toward the hallway. Making sure no one was watching, he stepped closer to the desk. His hand hovered over the crystal statue for a moment, almost hesitant. Then he pulled a folded cloth from his inside jacket pocket. With deliberate care, Marcus wrapped the eagle statue inside the cloth, muffling the sharp edges so they wouldn't clink. He opened his leather briefcase, placed the statue inside. Click. The latch shut softly. He adjusted his tie, ended the call, and walked out of the room like nothing had happened. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the screen. 9:27 a.m. The evidence was undeniable. Silence swallowed the office. Richard's face drained of color. The scoff that once curled on his lips was gone, replaced by something far heavier: realization. Marcus had worked beside him for 4 years, organized meetings, managed contracts, filtered calls. He had been trusted with confidential deals, private information, personal matters, and yet there it was, clear, precise, inescapable. Richard swallowed hard. That's not possible." His voice lacked conviction. Elena lowered the phone slightly, though she didn't turn it off. The paused frame still showed Marcus slipping the wrapped statue into his briefcase. "The footage is time-stamped and backed up automatically to cloud storage," she said quietly. "It can't be altered." Richard rubbed his forehead, packing once behind his desk. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable. Just minutes ago he had been certain of her guilt. Certain of his authority, now certainty had turned against him. The staff in the hallway slowly drifted closer again, drawn by the silence that felt louder than shouting. Why would he do that? Richard whispered, more to himself than to her. Elena didn't answer. It wasn't her place to speculate. Her role had simply been to clean, to work, to endure, but she had learned something important in this building. When things went wrong, suspicion always traveled downward, never upward. Richard stopped packing. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time that morning. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, no smirk, no satisfaction, only quiet strength. You recorded all of this? He asked. Yes, sir. You record every day, only while I'm working, for my protection. Was no accusation in her tone. But the implication hung in the air. She had felt unsafe, not physically but professionally, socially, reputationally. Richard exhaled slowly. The weight of that realization pressed against his pride. He had accused her within seconds. No investigation, no questions, just assumption. And she had come prepared, not with anger, not with tears, but with truth. He walked toward the door and closed it gently, shutting out the watching eyes in the hallway. When he turned back, his voice was different. Lower. Elena. Why didn't you ever report your concerns? She met his gaze. Because concerns aren't proof, and without proof they become complaints. And complaints from someone like me don't always end well. The words were soft, but they struck harder than shouting. Richard's shoulders sagged slightly. The room felt smaller now, more honest. He looked again at the frozen frame of Marcus on the screen, a man he had defended in meetings, recommended for bonuses, trusted blindly. I will deal with this immediately, Richard said at last. His tone carried authority again, but this time it was directed where it belonged. Elena nodded. Once the reality settled, something else filled the space between them. Not just embarrassment, not just guilt, understanding. Richard walked back to his desk and rested his palms against it, the same desk he had defended so fiercely minutes earlier. I owe you more than an apology, he said quietly. Elena remained silent. He looked at her again. You protected yourself because you felt no one else would. She didn't respond verbally, but she didn't need to. The truth was already visible. Richard straightened. That changes today. His voice was firm, not defensive, not proud, decisive. From now on, no accusation will be made in this building without evidence, and no employee will be judged based on position. He paused, then added, including you. For the first time, a faint warmth touched Elena's expression. Not victory, not revenge. Just recognition. Thank you, sir, she said softly. Richard extended his hand, something he had never done before with staff at her level. She hesitated only a second before shaking it. It wasn't just a handshake, it was accountability. As Elena stepped out into the hallway, the whispers stopped. The same people who had frozen earlier now looked at her differently, not with suspicion, not with pity, but with respect. Behind the closed office door, Richard picked up his phone, this time not to accuse, but to confront the truth. And in that quiet corridor, Elena walked back to her cart a little taller, not because she had exposed someone, but because she had refused to let herself be erased. Within an hour, security reviewed the footage. The atmosphere inside the building shifted from tension to controlled urgency. 2 uniformed security officers stood inside the surveillance room, replaying clips from multiple camera angles. Screens flickered with timestamps, hallways, offices, storage closets, every corner of the building suddenly telling a story that had gone unnoticed for months. Richard stood behind them, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw was locked, eyes fixed on the monitors. Elena remained near the doorway, quiet, unseen unless someone deliberately looked her way. The footage didn't lie. The assistant, Marcus, appeared again and again in different clips across different weeks, entering offices after hours, lingering near display shelves, slipping small valuables into his briefcase with smooth, practiced motions. A silver paperweight one week, a limited edition pen the next, a vintage watch gifted by a client. Each time something disappeared, murmurs followed. Whispers traveled through break rooms and supply closets. Suspicion always drifted toward the same group of people: janitorial staff, maintenance workers, interns, the ones without titles, the ones without power. Security pulled up inventory logs, cross-checked dates, compared timestamps. A pattern emerged, clean, precise, undeniable. Marcus had been stealing from Richard for months, slowly selling valuables and blaming staff members. When an item went missing, he would casually suggest a review of lower-level employees. He spoke calmly, strategically. We can't ignore internal theft, he would say. Sometimes it's the people closest to the assets. Richard, trusting and busy, had listened. Elena had known something was wrong for weeks. She hadn't had proof at first, just instincts. She noticed how certain items vanished only on days Marcus stayed late, how accusations surfaced too quickly, almost rehearsed. How he volunteered names before investigations even began. She stayed observant, careful, patient. She began documenting small details in a notebook she kept in her locker: dates, times, odd comments, changes in behavior. She wore the body camera not out of paranoia, but preparedness. She understood something most people ignored: when power protects itself, truth must protect you. The final clip played again on the large monitor, Marcus wrapping the crystal statue, placing it inside his briefcase. Security froze the frame. An officer exhaled slowly. "That's more than enough." Richard said nothing. His silence wasn't anger now. It was reckoning. Within minutes, two officers approached Marcus's office. Staff members felt the shift before they saw it. Conversations faded mid-sentence. Keyboards stopped clacking. Marcus looked up from his desk, surprised but composed. "Is something wrong?" One officer stepped forward. "So we need you to stand." Confusion flickered across Marcus's face, then calculation. His eyes darted toward the hallway, perhaps searching for Richard, but Richard wasn't there to defend him, not this time. The officers presented printed still images from the footage, time-stamped, clear, irrefutable. Marcus's confidence cracked, his shoulders stiffened. "This is a misunderstanding," he began. "I was safeguarding items. I was planning to save it." One officer interrupted calmly. They opened his desk drawers. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth and bubble lining, were several missing items reported over the last few months. A heavy silence fell across the floor as Marcus was escorted out in handcuffs. The metallic click echoed louder than any accusation ever had. Staff watched in shock. Some stepped back. Others stared openly. The same man who had walked these halls with authority now avoided eye contact. His expression drained of the superiority he once wore so comfortably. Whispers spread, but they were different now. Not suspicion, not rumor, but realization. Elena stood beside her cart near the far wall. She didn't smile. She didn't look satisfied. She simply observed. Richard emerged from his office slowly. He watched as Marcus passed him in restraints. For a brief second, their eyes met. Marcus's expression pleaded, perhaps for intervention, perhaps for silence, but Richard remained still. He had defended Marcus countless times, trusted his recommendations, allowed his subtle suggestions to shape decisions that affected innocent employees. Now the weight of that trust pressed heavily against his conscience. When the elevator doors closed behind the officers and Marcus, the building seemed to exhale. A chapter had ended, but something else had begun. Richard turned his gaze toward the staff gathered in the hallway. Faces that once carried tension now held something else, expectation. He cleared his throat. "Everyone return to your duties," he said quietly. The tone wasn't commanding. It was humbled. Slowly, people dispersed. But the energy lingered. Elena began pushing her cart down the corridor, resuming her tasks as if the morning had been ordinary. Richard watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Elena," she paused. He walked toward her not as a superior confronting staff, but as a man confronting his own failure. "You knew," he said softly. "I suspected," she corrected gently. He nodded. "And instead of accusing, you waited." "Truth doesn't need to rush," she replied. "It just needs space." The simplicity of her words unsettled him more than anger would have. For the first time in years, he had been wrong, not just wrong, unfair. He replayed the memory of his voice earlier that day. The edge. The assumption, the quickness to blame. He had built a reputation on decisiveness, on control, on reading people quickly, but somewhere along the way, decisiveness had blurred into prejudice. Control had blurred into arrogance. Reading people had turned into judging them. He looked down the corridor where staff moved more freely now, shoulders less tense, conversations less guarded. How many times had suspicion fallen on the wrong person? How many quiet humiliations had gone unnoticed because no one had spoken up? Richard inhaled deeply. "There will be changes," he said firmly. Elena met his eyes but said nothing. "Policies, oversight, accountability at every level." He hesitated, then added, "including mine." That admission carried weight. She nodded once. "I'm sorry," he said, not loudly, not performatively, but directly. Elena studied him for a moment. She had heard apologies before in life. Some hollow, some rushed, some strategic. This one felt different. "Thank you," she answered simply. As she continued down the hallway, sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the polished floors she had cleaned earlier. The same building, the same walls, but something fundamental had shifted. Respect had entered spaces where assumption once lived, and Richard remained standing in the corridor long after she disappeared from view. For the first time in years, authority felt heavier than power. It felt like responsibility, and he finally understood the difference. Later that night, Richard asked Alina to stay. She expected anger, maybe dismissal. Instead, he spoke quietly. "I owe you an apology." She nodded slightly. "I judged you," he admitted. "And I was ready to ruin your life without proof." Alina looked him in the eyes. "Sir, people don't always see us as individuals. Sometimes they only see uniforms." That sentence stayed with him. Richard had built empires, but he had never truly seen the people who cleaned them. The next morning shocked everyone. Richard called a company-wide meeting. In front of executives, managers, and staff, he played the footage. Then he did something no one expected. He apologized publicly to Alina, but she wasn't finished. Alina had been studying business management at night for 3 years. She showed Richard a detailed report she had prepared, pointing out major inefficiencies and internal security flaws in his company. She hadn't just protected herself, she had analyzed his system. Impressed by her intelligence and composure, Richard offered her a position in corporate security operations. She accepted on one condition. "I want better protections and respect for all service staff." He agreed. Months later, Alina was no longer invisible. She was head of internal compliance. And the billionaire who once yelled at her, he now introduced her proudly as the smartest person in this building.